Hello, I'm Brenda Allison, a bookseller at Barnes & Noble, and today I am so excited to be in conversation with debut novelist Florence Knapp. Florence's novel, The Names, is on sale now and destined to be one of your favorite reads of 2025. It is absolutely one of mine. I devoured it in one sitting. It wrecked me in the best way, and I still think about it. I can't wait to talk about it today. Florence, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. Really nice to be here with you.
Yeah, we're going to try really hard to have a spoiler-free conversation today. So let's get underway. The Names is a story of family, fate, choice, secrets, and ultimately hope. It is ridiculously propulsive and full of characters who will steer your heart. When I first read it, I described it to my friends as sliding doors meets life after life meets The Great Alone. I would love it if you could give us a synopsis of your debut novel, The Names.
So, as you said, it's a sliding doors novel that's kind of works on the kind of what if basis. And it's about how the name a person's given can shape the course of their life. And it opens in the wake of the 1987 storm, which in the UK here was our biggest storm for over 200 years and came almost completely without warning. So it's kind of quite a memorable event for people of a certain generation. And when Cora sets off the morning after this storm to register the birth of her son with her 9-year-old daughter Maya, the world's already in kind of complete disarray. And her husband, Gordon, is a local doctor who's really well respected in the community, and he's expecting for her to name their child after him, following kind of a long-standing family tradition. But as she gets nearer and nearer to the registrar's office, she's really starting to question whether it can be right to impose the burden of this legacy onto their son because her husband is awful. And the story then splits off into three, depending on the name she does give him. In one version of their life, he is named after his father, and he's Gordon, and a kind of really troubled figure who's very much raised in his father's mould. And in another version of their life, he is Bear, which is the name suggested by his elder sister, Maya, because she thinks the boy of that name would be kind of really soft and cuddly, but also brave and strong. And then in a third version, he's Julian, which is the name his mum set her heart on, kind of thinking that it would give him the space to become his own person. And the story follows them across 35 years and really looks at how a single decision, like the name we give our child, can kind of set in motion so many kind of infinite possibilities.
It's so neat. I remember when I read it, I kind of went in blind. It had been shown to me and then I forgot about it and I picked it back up and I was stunned by how it worked. I would love for you to tell us, like, how did it reveal itself to you? How did you come up with the idea? How did you structure it? Let's talk about it.
So I knew I wanted to write a story about how a name could shape a person's life. And the best way to do that, to kind of really explore it properly, seemed to be to do it by comparison. And so to do three versions of this boy's life and see how they could all unfold differently. And the way that I think the thing that sets these stories in motion differently from the start is Cora's husband's reaction to finding out what she's called their child. And then we revisit each of the boys every 7 years and really look at how their lives are unfolding and see kind of how different their lives are, but also the different people that they're becoming as a consequence of their different upbringings.
And how did you focus on like the meaning of a name? You know, I think we all take them for granted, our own names, the names of other people until you're having a child. And then it feels like a big, great responsibility.
Yeah.
You know, I would love to chat with you about like, how did that idea of a name defining you, how did that come to you? How did you think about it?
Well, I suppose I'm less interested in those traditional meanings that are behind our name, where you can look up its kind of traditional interpretation. I'm more interested in the associations that we bring to them. And so how other people perceive us through our names of, just basic things like, does our name sound soft or hard? And kind of, those kind of subconscious associations that they bring to it, maybe without even realizing, that maybe then have an impact on whether we get invited for a particular job interview or whether we meet a prospective partner and all of those things, but then also how it shapes our sense of self as well. In the book, Maya, who's Bear's older sister, well, all of the boys' older sister, says that when she goes into a shop with Bear and the shopkeeper leans over the counter and says, kind of, what's your name? That when Bear tells people his name, it's like holding a buttercup under their chin and kind of saying, do you like butter? And with everyone, it's like, yes, you love butter. Because the reaction to Bear is just so instant, that people smile and just look so delighted by it. And so the narrative that Bear grows up with is that he is totally accepted and loved by the world. And if you think of the contrast for Gordon with that, where he's been named after this awful father, which is kind of who's very much shaping his character and his upbringing. But if you also think about his interactions with the world, of that maybe in the same scenario where the shopkeeper leans over and says, "What's your name?" their reaction to him is likely to be maybe not quite so effusive as it is for hearing a name like Bear, which automatically maybe just slightly shifts how he interacts with the world and how he feels the world perceives him. And so I think a lot of it's kind of subtle and subconscious and things that we're probably not even aware of.
Right. And it's there's a line where Cora thinks that she says, perhaps calling their child something different would be a liberation, not at first, but later. And so that I was thinking, do the alternate names liberate them? Not just Bear and Julian, but the others as well. And that's really kind of a core tenet of the whole book, that liberation, that change. How did you see that?
I think in completely the same way as you do, because it's that the circumstances that unfold around each version of this boy's life not only affect him, they also affect his mother and his sister, and actually lots of people that they cross paths with, who in some versions of the story are kind of really big parts of the story, and in other narratives kind of fade away almost completely. So I think that one of the things that happens very early on is that if Cora dares to call her child, if she dares to go against tradition and call the child something completely different, it sets in motion something different for both her and her daughter. Because in the narrative where she calls him Julian, she has decided that she's going to decide the future she wants for her child. And with that, I think she then takes on their and her own life differently. Whereas in the one where she calls him Bear, which is Maya's kind of wish for her brother to be called, it instantly makes Maya feel listened to, probably, and empowered, probably for the first time in her life, because she's someone who's had to very much kind of stay in line to appease her father. And I think that really changes things for both of them. And you kind of see it fairly early on when they arrive home from the registrar's office, and in each version of the story, the baby is in the hallway and starts crying. And in the version where he's Gordon, Cora at some level, just briefly, has disassociated from him, because I think to have called him Gordon, which is her husband's name, she almost feels like she's sacrificed this perfect vision of her child that she had. Whereas when he's Bear, Maya, the sister, instantly goes to him and almost takes ownership over him and kind of comforts him from crying, takes him out of his snowsuit. And you can see how quickly it changes their relationship and how it changes them as people.
Yeah, absolutely. And then it's interesting that you were talking about that, because, in each scenario, even at the very beginning, you see a lot of the actions are the same. A lot of the events are the same, but you see the people react differently. How did you create the perspective and voice of the characters in those three different timelines? Did you plan it all out? Did you do it consecutively? How did you do it?
I think that I had a relatively clear idea of who they were at that starting point, because say when we meet Maya at the point at which her brother is being named, she's lived in this household for 9 years. So whatever the changes in her that come about by her brother being named, there's also she is still that 9-year-old girl who's spent 9 years in a really toxic environment. And so that's her starting point. But then I guess my job was to think, well, how would they be changed by each of these small things that start happening? And from there, I guess each person either grows or is constricted by their environment.
And did you plan that? Like, did you write it like all Bear, all Julian, all Gordon? Did you do the 7-year gaps individually and then do the 7-year gaps?
No, so I wrote it as you'll read it.
Oh,
so
yeah.
It visits each one of them. So I think it goes Bear, Julian, and Gordon in
Every
turn
time.
every 7
Yep.
years. Yeah. So I wrote it like that, and I think in terms of planning, I think what I always try to do when I'm writing is think about the emotional transition that I want each character to have made between the beginning of the novel and the end of the novel. And so I had a clear idea whereafter the novel follows them across 35 years.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had an idea of how they might be shaped by those first circumstances that we see them in 1987 in that first chapter, and the emotional transition that I wanted them to make and who I wanted each character to be by the end of the book.
Mm-hmm.
But between there, I left it pretty open because I suppose for me as a writer, it felt exciting to walk alongside them, to have the safety of those stepping stones to know, okay, they need to go roughly here next and then roughly here. But to also, I don't know, I guess to be discovering who they were going to be alongside them as they grew as people in my mind.
And as we, the reader, did, like, you get to see little tidbits. And I was going to ask about this later, but I'm going to ask about it now. I see the wall hanging in your background, and I know that you do some things with like paper piecing and quilting. And how did that experience and interest influence the piecing together of the stories to create the names?
So it was really odd. I think that sometimes, or certainly I don't always know what I want, what I'm trying to write about until after it's written and you look back on it. Or maybe even other people start talking to you about your book and you're kind of thinking, oh, yeah, no, that. And so many people afterwards said to me, oh, I can see so much similarity between your quilting, which is this on the wall isn't made by me, by the way, that's someone else's artwork. But my quilting tends to be quite intricate and kind of woven in. And I guess that there's an intricacy to the story I was trying to tell as well, in that you have these interweaving timelines where certain things will pop up in one narrative over there and then up over here. And in a way, that's what you're trying to do with quilting, I think, is that if you have a kind of pop of mustard over here or something, you then want it to appear in a way that feels organic down here and maybe there. And you're trying to create a kind of balance. And I guess that's what I was trying to do across each of these narratives was trying to create a balance within their lives, so that you've got some darkness, some lightness, and it unfolds in the way all of our lives do, so that some years are really wonderful, but some years are much, much harder.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that when you're making a quilt, you're also balancing light and dark and pattern and texture and all of those things. And so there's so much similarity in there that I didn't see when I was writing it, but I can now.
Oh, isn't that funny?
Yeah.
Yeah, because when I went to read it the second time to prepare for today, I noticed little tiny details early in the story or in the middle of the story that I knew, because I knew what happened, were going to matter later. Or, you have this, and this is a great point. I want to talk about this cast of characters. And there are characters that, are big parts of one timeline and small parts of the others. So it's really interesting to me to hear you talk about that weaving process, that piecing process, and how sometimes you don't see it until you step outside it yourself. Yeah. So I would love to talk about the characters there. I loved some of them, and you don't love some others.
Yeah.
So many of them they're so real. They're so well-rounded. I would love to, talk about the main characters, Cora and Maya and Bear, Julie, and Gordon.
So I think what defines Cora for me is that in each narrative, she is in really difficult circumstances trying to be the best mother she can be. And in the narrative where her child's called Gordon and her husband is a much more of a presence in their life throughout the book, we see her character constrained, and initially she has this reaction of kind of disassociating from her child. But very quickly something happens that makes that maternal pull come back really, really strongly. And I think that's the really gorgeous thing I hope about Cora, is that she is an amazing mother in each version of their lives, no matter what happens to them and to her and the circumstances that are thrown at her. And with Maya, who is Bear Gordon Julian's elder sister, I think we see her character unfold in different ways. And I guess one of the ways is in her sexuality. So Maya is gay, and in the narrative where her brother is called Bear and the father has very minimal impact on their life, is probably the narrative where she is also able to embrace that and just kind of go on with her life and just be.
Yeah, it just is what it is.
Yeah, it is what it is. It is not a big deal. And in the narrative where her brother's Julian, and I guess in that narrative she's brought up by her grandmother, who is this gorgeous presence in their life, and she's kind of very liberal and embracing of them and accepting of them. And you'd think that this was also a narrative where she would be also able to accept her own sexuality. And actually, what I think we see is that she almost shuts down that part of herself completely. She's not interested in boys or girls. She doesn't have relationships. She has kind of she exists rather than inviting joy into her life. And I think in some ways that's about her feeling that she has things to make amends for and guilt in her life, and that stops her being who she really should be. And in the Gordon narrative, I think one of the things that surprised me, and I wonder whether it'll surprise other people, but it kind of made sense to me when I thought about it, is that she very much knows that she's gay and has a kind of secret relationship and that she keeps from her family, but is very comfortable with the fact that she's gay. And when I thought about that afterwards, I thought, well, actually, of course she would be, because her whole childhood has almost groomed her for being able to keep a secret.
She's used to keeping secrets.
Yeah. And so
That's
for her, actually, it felt she was able to exist as the person she really was, but in a very, it wasn't something she could be open with her family about.
Right. I want to go back to talk about Cora and this theme of like protecting our children. The grandmother, I'm going to ask you how to pronounce her name because I don't think I'm doing it correctly. Is it Silva?
No. I think it's Shilva.
Shilva. There we go.
But so the English version of that would be Sylvia, and I think in Irish it's Shilva.
So Shilva tells Cora in one version of the story, like, I'm sorry, I didn't know. I'm your mother. It's my job to know and protect you.
Yeah.
There's this kind of running theme about protecting our children. And I would love for you to talk about how you thought about that in writing the book, in the different maternal characters, how you saw that interweaving through the stories.
Yeah, there were lots of interesting things that came up for me with that. One was that even in the narrative where Cora has, so her children have very, very early on, her husband is no longer on the scene, and they get to live kind of lives of relative freedom after a really, really difficult start. And yet, even with that, I think we see Cora struggling with when her children reach that point in their lives when they're going off out into the world to kind of, be independent beings, that she's struggling quite with how to deal with that. And
I wrote the quote down from that part. She says, the job of parenting changes as your children grow. She says, would you lay down your life for your child? Yes, she has done this, but she hadn't known there would be a second reckoning where this would mean eventually laying down the arms of motherhood. And I loved how you described it. My kids are adolescents, tweens. And so I'm starting to do that push-pull thing.
Yeah.
And I hadn't thought of it quite that way. So I would love for you to talk about that idea of like, eventually you're going to have to stop protecting them all the time to be a good mother.
And it's, I think Cora realizes that she's spent the whole of their childhoods trying to protect them and keep them safe. And it started with spending 9 years trying to keep her daughter safe when they were living with her husband. And then even when they weren't with them, she has that natural parenting thing if you want to keep your children safe. And then as her son reaches the point when he leaves home, she suddenly realizes, actually, my job now is to step back and not constantly be putting worry and fear in his mind by kind of questioning what he's doing, and really to let him venture out into the world and become the person he needs to be. She has a conversation with, she has a friend called Mary, and Mary's a very, very different mother from her. And Mary is much more, I think there's a point where she talks about them, that if parenting was like baking, if parenting was like cooking or baking a cake, kind of Mary just kind of throws in bits and pieces in as like, oh, a pinch of that, a pinch of this, and it will all come out fine. And Cora realizes that she's much more kind of like, oh gosh, I need to weigh everything out and try and do my best to get it right. And finds, and I think I'm probably more like Cora in that. So it's kind of, and
I am too. Yep.
Yeah, is kind of really battling with her own, her own need to step back.
It made me think of, I don't know if you've ever read it. There's a book called This Is How It Always Is by Laurie Frankel. And it's a very specific story about raising a trans child. But at one point early in the book, the parents are trying to decide to do what is right. And, they say, oh, but you don't ever know if it is right until 20 years down the road. And they say, this is how it always is. And it's a line I use about parenting all the time, too. Like that idea of like, we're doing this work now, and whether we're meticulous or we're throwing everything at the wall, like you can only do what you know is right today. And this is
and you're just trying to do your best.
Right.
The whole time. And it's kind of, and that both of those mothering styles are done with the absolute best intentions, and you just don't know how it's kind of going to come out in the wash, I guess.
Right. Talking about Mary, who is the neighbor of Cora and Gordon at the beginning of the story, kind of leads me into talking about this idea of the larger chosen family, which you see in some of the stories, versus the nuclear family that you see more in one story. And I would love to talk about, like, how did you kind of feel out this idea of kind of this larger chosen family for the little family that we grow to love in the book?
I guess it was that I think you see in all versions of their life that there are people there who want to step in and be there for them, but can't necessarily. And I think that one of the things that really interests me is fate and chance, and the kind of whole sliding doors premise, I guess. And in one version of their lives, we see Mary offer friendship to Cora, and I think she sees what's going on between Cora and her husband Gordon and wants to be there for her, but Cora has to kind of push her away, I guess, out of, in some ways she's doing it because she feels actually to invite Mary in would be to risk upsetting the balance with her family, and then she risks kind of losing her children and all sorts of things like that because her husband would take them from her. And so the risks of friendship are too great for her. Whereas in some of the other narratives, that friendship's kind of doing other things, and is very much, as you said, it's a chosen family. And I think there's so much joy in that. Well, I think one of the things I guess I was trying to do is say, here's this really, really dysfunctional, awful family. But actually throughout the book, what I hope I'm also presenting is lots of versions of different families that, yes, they're all messy and they're all imperfect, but they're also gorgeous and warm and are just bringing so much joy into each other's lives. And that here's some versions of families working really, really well as well.
Absolutely. And, you're kind of talking about like each scenario, they're not all bad or all good. There are definitely times when you're like, oh, this is one, this is it. This is what I hope the real story is, but I think part of the story is about this idea of, you were saying like fate versus chance, and, one little different thing happens and not everything changes, but so much changes.
Yeah.
And you see that in each story, and you see redemption and fighting and ugliness and secrets in every
Yeah.
story too, and in every family. I
Yeah.
would love to talk about that idea of, the before and after, the magical thinking, the, fate versus choice. I would love to hear your thoughts on it.
Often it's kind of that we're shaped by all sorts of things like our upbringing and our environment and our material circumstances and all of those things. But that as we see these three boys move into adulthood, each of them has something that happens in their life where it's that, yes, you're the product of all of these things, but actually, here's a moment where you get to decide who you want to be in the world and how you're going to touch the lives of others. And to me, that feels really, really hopeful because it's, you see someone who's been through a childhood like Gordon, who is really the product of his father, and I think has been manipulated so badly by his father. And I think gets to a point in his life where he's thinking, actually, is this the person who I want to be?
Right.
And to me, it feels so hopeful that actually in adulthood, there are these points where you can transcend an upbringing like that. It's yes, you're determined. Who we are is determined by all sorts of things, but there's also choice and autonomy
Right.
within that. And I think even where those things have been positive, say like with Bear, his elder sister Maya does this thing when he's a toddler that's really sweet, where she gets him to put up his hands as though they're kind of bear paws and say,
Yep.
I'm bear and I'm wild and I'm free. And it's this really lovely thing that she's doing because her own childhood had been so constrained by living with their father, who they're no longer living with. But I think at some level, Bear internalizes this narrative and he feels that his role in the world is to be off adventuring. And it takes something drastic happening much later on in his adult life for him to suddenly think, oh, actually, can I also be someone who enjoys putting down roots too?
Mm-hmm.
And am I going to be there for, his partner and kind of, so even he who kind of seems like he lives a much easier and more charmed life actually has things from his childhood where later he has a reckoning where it's, do I cast them off or and decide who I'm going to be rather than be the product entirely of my childhood?
Which kind of leads me to talk about this idea of generational trauma, how it defines and affects us, even when we escape it and it's no longer a part of our lives. I think there's a part where I think it's in the Julian timeline. He says, well, maybe my father was the way he was because of his own father, and maybe it's not genetic. And, I want to talk about these characters breaking cycles. And like you said, that theme of autonomy in the book for all the characters.
I think that one of the things that I hope that I guess I wanted to look at with the book was a character's ability to have lived a particular life and made lots of mistakes, and then not necessarily to put those mistakes behind them, because I think part of becoming a rounded person is to actually absorb those mistakes, accept who you've been, and then to, I guess, kind of recreate yourself out of the wreckage. Which I
Yes,
think
there's
is
a
what
part
we
where
see.
Gordon is in the garden and he like sees a statue and it's all cracked and stuff. And he
Yeah,
talks about, and for part of the book, you want Gordon to be better, you want him to get it. And then he talks about building something new out of the broken pieces.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
And he doesn't necessarily go back and ask the people he's hurt for forgiveness, which I think is important. I think
Mm-hmm.
what he actually does is just thinks, okay, from this day forth, who do I want to be?
Mm-hmm.
And how am I going to touch other people? And to me, that feels like he's, I don't know, just taking possession of himself, I guess,
Mm-hmm.
and deciding who he wants to be.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one other thing I wanted to talk about was kind of of course, domestic violence plays a large role in the novel, the cycle of abuse and the difficulty of escape. And it also often involves death, as it does in some of these
Yeah.
scenarios. Did you do a lot of research on domestic violence? Let's talk about that part of the book.
About 6 months before I started writing the book, I happened to hear someone talking from a local women's refuge, and it had had a really profound impact on me where I couldn't quite get it out of my head. And so when I first started writing the names, I was put back in touch with her by a mutual friend, and was able to ask her about the dynamic that would form around a character like Gordon. And she was so helpful, because I think at that point I was still very much thinking about how I wanted each narrative to unfold, and was kind of thinking, well, could there be redemption for Gordon Senior? I'm talking the father figure rather than Gordon Junior. I'm talking about here. And when I spoke to her about it, she said, actually, no, that isn't what would happen kind of in this scenario, because the type of person he is and the type of career he's made for himself, where he's kind of, he's very well respected in the local community, and he's kind of put himself up on a pedestal where he would have to humble himself so much to admit who he was to kind of have any hope of making himself better, that he simply wouldn't be able to do that. And so that was really helpful to speak to her and to know what I needed to do to not paint a picture that wasn't going to be true to people's real experiences, even though this is a fictional story and it's not based on any real experiences. Although I've since, after I'd finished writing the novel, the woman from the Women's Refuge very kindly read it for me and said, "Oh, it is kind of horribly accurate." And actually, she's worked with thousands and thousands of families and said, "Actually, I've seen all of these things happen. It's you haven't come up with anything new," which is kind of really, I guess, the sadness of these things.
Absolutely. But in this book, I think you've found some beauty and detail out of the sadness. The building something new out of broken pieces, like we talked about. You really talk about the fleeting nature of things. How do we spend our, one wild and precious life?
I love that quote.
Yeah, me too.
And I wasn't the person who associated it with
Mary
book,
Oliver.
by the way.
It's Mary Oliver. How do you see your characters in this book spending their one life?
It's really funny, actually. There's a restaurant in Covent Garden called Cora and Pearl. And I didn't know about it when I was writing the book.
Really?
I was looking past it one evening and thought, oh my goodness. So there's a narrative. So Pearl is a child that
Later in the book?
one of the narratives much, much later on, who is kind of Cora's granddaughter. And so it was kind of funny because I guess I was walking past thinking, oh my goodness, so in another version of their lives, they go on to
it's all connected together. And right? There are no coincidences.
I like to think that with all of them, however we find them at the end, that their lives were richer or made richer over the course of the novel, and the people that they surrounded themselves by and came in contact with, and the kind of through their own growth, I guess. And yeah.
Beautiful. Is there anything else you would want people to know about this novel that we have not discussed?
Maybe some of the books that had inspired me, actually.
Oh, great. That's like my next question.
Oh, wonderful.
But tell us what inspired you. We'd love to hear it.
So there's been several books over the years where I've loved the way they've handled something. One of them is Celeste's Little Fires Everywhere.
Oh, yes.
I think she wrote about creativity just so beautifully. And I think as a creative person myself, I kind of read that and really aspired to find a way to work creativity into a novel in the way that she did there. I just thought that was gorgeous. And then Such a Fun Age by Kiley. I read that and it felt like a lesson in how to maintain narrative tension that just left my head spinning.
I gasped out loud on an airplane and I still remember it. Yep.
It's kind of and that you finish each chapter thinking there's no way she'll still have the tension that high when the next chapter starts. And she did every time.
And she does.
It never broke. It's just, that was amazing. And so that felt like a real, it felt like reading it felt like a lesson in a way, as well as being an amazing piece of fiction. But as a writer, it felt like you could actually take something from it and learn from it, I guess. And then I really love Claire Keegan's novels. I think they
Just little gifts.
Yeah, they have a quietness about them that is so powerful. And I love that she shows that you can be, you know, that you can have a really quiet novel that still has impact. I think she's amazing.
And the characters feel like real people living real lives, which I think The Names does so well as well. So yeah, my last question is always like, what are you currently reading and loving? You know.
So recently I've read, but I think it's Take My Hand by Dolen Perkins-Valdez.
Oh, she is prepared. Look at that.
You may not actually. It may be that in the US it's got a complete cover, but this is our cover. It's based on true events in the 1970s about it's based on a medical scandal where young underage Black girls were being sterilized without their consent. And it was, I don't know whether it's a widely known scandal in the US, but it certainly wasn't something I knew about in the UK. And so it's kind of this absolutely horrifying premise, but right from the opening pages, I just felt in such safe hands with her as a storyteller. She tells the story so beautifully in a way that really has a lot of kind of emotional resonance. And it was a really, really good book. It stayed with me.
Excellent. I'll have to pick it up. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us. This has been absolutely delightful, and I truly, truly love this book, and I'm so glad we got a chance to chat.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.